a chilling phone call in the middle of the day, with a confession so terrifying it sent shivers down the spine of anyone who heard it. But what secret was truly hidden behind that call, one that caused everything to spiral out of control almost instantly? It all began on a Sunday morning at 11:30 a.m. on June 6, 2021, in the city of Jeonju, located in North Jeolla Province, South Korea. A woman in her 30s, referred to as A, was getting ready to head out when her phone suddenly rang. On the screen appeared the name of Ms. Kang, 38 years old, a woman she was acquainted with. Daytime calls from Kang were unusual. She typically worked night shifts at entertainment venues, so something about this felt off. Following her instinct, A picked up the call immediately. On the other end, Kang's voice was frantic and furious. She confessed that, in a moment of emotional breakdown during a heated argument, she had killed her boyfriend. At first, A didn't know how to respond. Unsure if Kang was speaking out of anger or actually admitting to a crime, she asked an acquaintance to check on Kang's apartment, a small studio located in the Uadong neighborhood of Jeonju's Deokjin district, where Kang's boyfriend was known to live. Less than an hour later, at approximately 12:16 p.m., the acquaintance arrived at the apartment and rang the doorbell. Kang opened the door, looking drained and expressionless, as if she had been expecting someone. The moment they looked inside, they froze in horror. The floor was streaked with deep red stains blood. Stepping in, they were stunned to find 22-year-old Jun-su, Kang's boyfriend, collapsed beside the bed. A wave of panic hit the visitor, momentarily paralyzing them. Jun-su had suffered multiple stab wounds, clear evidence of a violent attack. While still in shock, the visitor managed to pull it together and dialed emergency services to report a critically injured individual. Police arrived at the scene shortly after and began assessing the situation. Jun-su had been stabbed a total of 34 times, with most of the wounds concentrated in critical areas like the neck and chest. Although he was rushed to the hospital, he succumbed to his injuries due to massive blood loss. As soon as officers confirmed his death, Kang was arrested on the spot. However, at the station, she remained emotionally unstable and uncooperative. It wasn't until 3 hours later that she calmed down enough to provide a statement. Even then, she showed no remorse, insisting that her actions were justified. Based on Kang's initial testimony, investigators quickly expanded the scope of the case to examine the relationship between the two. According to her account, Kang and Jun-su had been dating for about 10 months, from August 2020 to June 2021. Both lived alone, so they frequently visited each other's homes and had eventually shared their door lock passwords, something they considered normal in their intimate relationship. However, as investigators delved deeper into their relationship, it became clear that it was far from peaceful. The couple frequently argued, broke up, and reconciled, often with Kang being the one to reach out first. At the time, Jun-su was just 22 years old, while Kang was 16 years older. That age gap may have contributed to Kang becoming emotionally dependent and struggling to accept the idea of separation. Tensions escalated about a month before the incident. On May 30th, Kang showed up unannounced at Jun-su's apartment, hoping to surprise him with a sweet gesture. But as soon as the door opened, she was hit with a devastating scene. Jun-su was with his ex-girlfriend. Shocked and furious, Kang screamed and stormed out, refusing to let Jun-su explain. To this day, the reason why he met up with his ex remains unknown. After that event, Kang's emotions toward Jun-su became increasingly conflicted. She began to feel insecure and hurt about dating someone significantly younger. During their relationship, Jun-su had also secretly gone drinking with other women, and even told others he didn't have a girlfriend, making Kang feel hidden and disrespected. Looking at Kang's circumstances, one can partly understand the burden of insecurity she carried. She worked in the nightlife entertainment industry, often stigmatized in society. The 16-year age gap was already a hurdle, not to mention that Kang had previously been divorced and had 2 children. Although the children lived with their paternal grandparents and didn't interfere in the relationship, once Jun-su learned about her past, he began to grow distant. Unwilling to accept this growing emotional gap, especially after catching him with someone else, Kang made an effort to reconnect a few days later. She met up with Jun-su, expressing her desire to start fresh. She proposed living together and even suggested a trip to Yeosu at the end of June as a new beginning for their relationship. From that point on, Kang became hopeful and excited about the idea of getting back together. She began planning the trip meticulously, reserving a villa, researching popular restaurants, and organizing everything down to the smallest detail. At the same time, she continued texting Jun-su, telling him she believed the getaway could help them rebuild their connection and rediscover their love. However, that hope was shattered within just a few days. One evening, the couple attended separate social gatherings with friends. Kang kept texting Jun-su throughout the night and even received a few photos showing him drinking. But as the night wore on, her anxiety grew. By around 4 a.m., Jun-su suddenly stopped replying. Her messages went unanswered, and her calls went straight to voicemail. The silence continued until 10 a.m. the next morning, heightening Kang's concern. She feared that Jun-su may have drunk too much and gotten into trouble. At 10:45 a.m., she rushed to his apartment and used the shared door code to let herself in. She found Jun-su passed out, drunk and fast asleep on his bed. Thinking he had simply overdone it and hadn't heard the phone, Kang felt a bit of relief until her eyes landed on his phone lying next to the bed. It immediately caught her attention. While Jun-su was still fast asleep, Kang, curious to see whether he had finally changed how her name appeared in his phone, as he had once promised, picked up his phone. Previously, she discovered that he had saved her as Kang's sister, which made her feel distant and unimportant. She had asked him several times to change it to something more affectionate. To check, she called his number from her own phone. The call rang through, but only a string of digits appeared on the screen, indicating that her contact had been deleted. That discovery left Kang confused and unsettled. She couldn't believe that Jun-su had quietly erased her name. To confirm, she tried making a video call via Kakao Talk, only to be met with a message saying she had been blocked and the connection could not be completed. The more she thought about it, the more unstable everything seemed. How could someone who had just been texting her and sending pictures at dawn suddenly delete her number and block her just hours later? Possibilities began racing through her mind, and the one that frightened her the most was this. Maybe Jun-su had met someone else at the party and was already trying to cut ties with her. Panic quickly morphed into a whirlwind of rage and despair. A storm of thoughts flooded her mind, feelings of betrayal, anger, and heartbreak. As she looked at Jun-su, still peacefully asleep and unaware of anything, a chilling thought struck her. If she couldn't have him, no one else would. In that very moment, Kang stood up, eyes burning with determination. She went into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, wrapped paper around the handle, and approached the bed. Without hesitation, she plunged the blade into Jun-su's chest. He jolted awake and fell to the floor, but he couldn't fight back. In a helpless state, he was stabbed 34 more times, targeting his neck, back, and chest. From that point forward, everything spiraled out of control. Though Jun-su struggled briefly, his body soon collapsed under the relentless, brutal attack. Blood poured out from his chest and neck wounds, and he slowly lost consciousness in overwhelming pain. The attack lasted nearly 30 minutes. Yet Kang did nothing to help. She simply stood there, cold and detached, watching him suffer as he slipped into death. When the police arrived, they arrested her at the scene and charged her with murder, based on her own confession. The case shocked the public and dominated headlines as a horrific example of a relationship turned deadly. But just a month later, in July, 2 petitions were posted on the official national petition page of the Blue House, sparking a wave of public doubt and revealing shocking new details behind the case. It was through these petitions that the public learned the entire narrative had been based solely on Kang's version of events. There was no concrete evidence or clear information about how Jun-su had responded during their arguments or while planning the trip to Yeosu. The victim's family raised serious concerns about the one-sided nature of the investigation, which they outlined in detail within their petitions. From a completely different perspective, Jun-su's family insisted that this was not a simple crime of passion as portrayed by the media, but the brutal murder committed by an obsessive stalker. According to them, the relationship had lasted only about a month and a half, not 10 months as Kang had claimed. And even in that short time, Jun-su was under constant psychological pressure from her. Kang's controlling behavior quickly became alarming. She frequently checked Jun-su's phone without his knowledge, and every time they were apart, she bombarded him with questions, asking where he was, who he was with, why he hadn't responded, demanding that he send photos to prove his location, and even forcing him to keep the speaker on during calls. It didn't stop there. Kang's obsession escalated to an extreme. Whenever Jun-su failed to respond the way she wanted, she would rush to his apartment unannounced. She had memorized his lock code by watching him enter it and used it to come and go freely. Throughout the relationship, Jun-su felt suffocated. He had no space, no privacy. Eventually, the mounting emotional strain forced Jun-su to end the relationship. He told Kang clearly that they could no longer be together, but Kang refused to accept it. For the next 8 months, she relentlessly texted, called, and showed up at his home, following and harassing him without pause. Even after being blocked multiple times, she would return to his doorstep, screaming insults and sobbing loudly in front of neighbors. Kang's behavior didn't just affect Jun-su's personal life, it humiliated him in front of his neighbors and pushed him to the brink emotionally. She took control of everything, even making decisions about shared plans like booking lodging for trips without his input. Because he couldn't take the pressure anymore, Jun-su eventually sent Kang a photo of himself drinking with friends, just to appease her and stop the harassment. That night, she had been constantly texting and calling him. Exhausted and fed up, he sent the photo, then deleted her number and blocked her on KakaoTalk. But what he didn't realize was that this simple act would spark the final, tragic chain of events. What happened next only deepened the family's anger. They argued that if sex offenders can have their names publicly revealed, then someone who repeatedly trespassed and ultimately committed murder should not be allowed anonymity. While the decision lay with the courts, the family pleaded for officials to consider public opinion and the pain this case had caused across society. Based on this reasoning, they demanded that Kang's identity be made public to reflect the seriousness of the crime. However, Kang's defense attorney claimed she had committed the act while intoxicated and suffering from severe depression, rendering her incapable of fully understanding her actions. They requested leniency on that basis. When asked for supporting evidence, the defense submitted medical records showing that Kang had undergone psychiatric treatment about a year before the incident, but prosecutors immediately rejected the claim. They pointed out that Kang had been questioned 3 hours after her arrest, ample time to regain composure, and that during her statement, she had clearly and calmly described every step of the crime. Beyond Kang's detailed confession, prosecutors also presented additional evidence pointing to her level of preparation and mental clarity prior to the crime. Notably, Kang had sent multiple threatening messages in advance, warning that she would harm Jun-su. During the attack itself, she carefully wrapped paper around the knife handle, both to prevent slipping and to avoid getting blood on her clothes. This suggested calculated planning. The stab wounds were all directed at vital areas of the body, indicating precision and intent in her actions. For these reasons, the court sided with the prosecution's view. When asked about her motive, Kang claimed she acted out of rage upon discovering that Jun-su hadn't saved her name in his phone. The panel of judges deemed this reasoning completely irrational and unacceptable by any moral or legal standard. What stirred public controversy even further was Kang's demeanor throughout the initial trial. She showed no remorse whatsoever. Considered to have low potential for rehabilitation, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. 4 months later, an appeal trial was held. At that hearing, Kang broke down in tears and begged the court for leniency. For the first time, her defense team claimed that the motive for the murder was not as simple as her original statement had suggested. From that point, certain details were submitted to the court, though not released publicly, to protect the privacy of the victim's family. Because the crime was not classified as premeditated or committed as part of an organized offense, and since Kang now showed regret, the likelihood of reoffending was deemed low. Taking these factors into account, the court reduced her sentence to 22 years in prison instead of life. Beyond the legal outcome, what left the public most unsettled was how societal perceptions of stalking victims were flipped on their head. There is often an assumption that only women can be targeted. But this case made it clear. Being stalked is a threat that can happen to anyone, regardless of gender. Jun-su's case proved that. For this very reason, what seemed at first like a simple crime of jealousy ended up exposing a darker, deeper truth, one rooted in obsessive behavior and the trauma of being followed. The story takes an even more haunting turn when looking back to another chilling case. On the afternoon of May 28, 2004, at around 2 p.m., in a villa located in Jeonnam-dong, Seongbuk district of Seoul, a young elementary school student named B returned home after class. As he stepped through the front gate, he noticed the main door was slightly ajar. His mother sometimes forgot to fully close the door, so he thought little of it at first. Calling out to her as usual, he opened the door and walked in, but the house was silent. The familiar greeting he expected from his mother never came. The boy called her name and began searching the rooms. A growing sense of dread crept in as he entered the master bedroom and was met with a nightmare. His mother lay on the floor, her body covered in deep bruises as if she had been savagely beaten. Her nose was broken, the area around her eyes torn and caked with dried blood. Worse still, an extension cord had been tightly wrapped around her neck. In addition to the blunt force trauma, she had been stabbed multiple times, soaking the bed in blood. The boy screamed in horror and rushed to embrace his mother one final time. Shortly afterward, police arrived at the scene, and a chilling tension began to spread across the otherwise peaceful neighborhood in Seongbuk. The investigative team from the Seongbuk police station immediately launched a manhunt. Based on the level of brutality, authorities initially speculated that the suspect was likely a man, given the physical strength required to carry out such an attack. However, aside from that preliminary assessment, a thorough search of the scene yielded no clear evidence. Most notably, there were no signs of forced entry. This suggested the victim had opened the door herself, allowing the killer to enter. Adding to the mystery, there was a pet dog in the house. Had it sensed danger, it likely would have barked during the attack. But according to neighbors, no one heard any unusual noises. This further reinforced the theory that the perpetrator was someone familiar to the victim, someone the dog didn't perceive as a threat. Even more baffling, no footprints or DNA samples were left behind. Faced with this eerie silence, investigators shifted focus to those closest to the victim. Her husband, Mr. Park, was immediately placed under scrutiny as the primary person of interest, and yet, the more they learned about the victim's life, the more confused investigators became. The victim, identified as Ms. A, was 36 years old at the time of her death. She was a stay-at-home mom, known for being quiet, devoted to her family, and leading a low-profile life. A thorough check of her social and personal circles revealed no clear enemies or individuals with a motive to harm her. Among those closest to her, only her husband remained as a potential lead. Mr. Park, 46 years old, was 10 years older than his wife and ran a fashion business. He was the owner of a company with numerous employees and was widely known for having a strong, loving relationship with his wife and child. On the day of the murder, May 28th, Mr. Park reportedly left home for work at 8:25 a.m. At that time, their son had already gone to school, and Ms. A was believed to be alive, as she had seen him off from inside the house. This placed the estimated time of death between 8:25 a.m. and 2 p.m. when their son returned home. To verify his alibi, police went to his office to examine his daily schedule. Their investigation confirmed that all of Mr. Park's statements aligned with the available evidence. As a result, he was officially removed from the list of suspects. But that left investigators at a dead end. There were no other viable leads. 10 days after the murder, with the case going cold, police shifted their strategy. They began reviewing phone call records from the victims and her husband's mobile devices. This required analyzing cell tower data by geographic zones, a process that was both complex and required a high degree of precision. Then came a surprising breakthrough. Investigators discovered an unusual pattern of phone activity directed at Mr. Park's phone. Specifically, in the 2 months leading up to the murder, more than 250 calls had been made from the same number to his cell phone, his office line, and even his home phone. The frequency and scope of these contacts immediately raised major red flags, making the number a prime target in the investigation. Faced with undeniable evidence, Mr. Park was forced to admit that he had once had a brief affair with another woman. However, according to him, after he ended the relationship, the woman refused to accept the breakup and persistently tried to contact him. He testified that the affair began about a year earlier, after a chance encounter with a woman named Lee. Even though she knew he was married, Lee actively pursued him and gradually pressured him to divorce his wife. Realizing the relationship had crossed a line, Mr. Park decided to cut it off. Despite her clear motive, police initially hesitated to consider Lee a suspect. The brutality of the crime led them to doubt whether a woman could have carried out such a vicious attack. Moreover, the crime scene indicated that the attacker had quickly overpowered the victim, something that would require significant physical strength. Lee, by contrast, was petite and physically weaker than Ms. A. From a purely physical standpoint, it seemed unlikely she could have committed the murder alone. Oddly enough, at what appeared to be the most suspicious point for Lee, she had an alibi that sparked debate. Lee held U.S. citizenship and was married to a Korean national. According to immigration records, she had traveled frequently between the U.S. and South Korea over the previous 2 years. However, on May 28th, the same day the murder occurred, she left the country at 5 p.m. This meant that during the likely time of death, Lee was not in South Korea. To verify her alibi, investigators traced her last known residence in Korea, her mother's house. They quickly identified the address and examined phone records, discovering that Lee had made 3 calls from the home's landline to her husband in the U.S. The calls were made at 8:54 a.m., 12:20 p.m., and 12:38 p.m., all within the estimated time frame of the murder. As suspicions mounted, Lee became visibly upset and strongly denied any involvement. She claimed she had stayed at her mother's home until leaving for the airport, and that the timing of her departure on the day of the murder was purely coincidental, caused by unavoidable visa issues. Meanwhile, a separate investigative lead opened up a new angle when police reviewed Mr. Park's call records in detail. In addition to calls from the former mistress, there were several from an unidentified number. Upon tracing its ownership, investigators were surprised to find that the number belonged to Lee's cousin. This new lead prompted immediate field verification. Police located the cousin, a woman residing in South Korea. At the time, her home was only about a 10-minute drive from Lee's mother's house. When officers arrived at the scene, they saw both Lee's cousin and her female relative working together at a small family-run restaurant. Immediately afterward, the police conducted a brief on-site interrogation to clarify the connection between Lee and her cousin during the sensitive time frame leading up to the murder. They confirmed that the two had spoken the night before and asked for an explanation of the call's content, why Lee had used her cousin's phone, and other related matters. However, instead of clearing things up, the cousin's behavior only made the situation more suspicious. Throughout the questioning, she appeared nervous and gave vague, inconsistent answers, at times saying she couldn't remember clearly, and at other times claiming she wasn't sure. Her evasiveness raised even more red flags. The tipping point came when she suddenly broke down in tears, insisted she had nothing to do with the crime, and emotionally collapsed, unable to answer further questions. Seeing her daughter so unstable, Lee's mother could no longer stay silent and decided to speak up. She told police that around 11:30 a.m. on the day of the murder, Lee had suddenly shown up at the restaurant in a state of panic, muttering something about a serious incident and urgently looking for a flight back to the U.S. By around 1:30 p.m., Lee had left, visibly frightened and emotionally shattered. At that moment, her mother began to suspect that Lee had indeed done something terrible. After Lee left, she went into the kitchen to check and found a knife in the sink, its handle separated from the blade. Alarmed by the sight, and considering Lee's panicked state, both mother and daughter feared it might have been the murder weapon. Panicked, They wrapped the knife in a plastic bag and threw it into the dumpster in front of the restaurant. As police cross-checked the testimonies, a major contradiction quickly surfaced. If the mother's account was true, how could there have been phone records showing Lee had made calls to her husband from the landline at her mother's house during the exact time of the murder? To resolve this, the police immediately requested signal verification from the telecommunications provider and received data from the nearest cell tower. The tower data revealed what the testimonies could not explain. Of the 3 calls Lee made to her husband, the first 2 originated from a tower near her mother's home, but the final call came from a tower near her cousin's restaurant. When matched against the likely movements of the killer that day, the signal path showed a suspiciously consistent overlap. At that point, the full picture began to take shape. Lee had been near the victim A's home at the time of the murder. After committing the crime, she rushed to her cousin's restaurant, booked a ticket, and headed straight to the airport to flee to the United States. With the evidence now considered conclusive, police issued an international arrest warrant through Interpol and requested that the U.S. government extradite Lee. Despite strong evidence pointing to Lee as the murderer, investigators continued probing the case to solidify their conclusion. The reason, even though the suspect had been identified, one detail still troubled them: Lee weighed approximately about 29 pounds less than the victim, Ms. A. That physical discrepancy raised a critical question. Could Lee have carried out such a brutal attack on her own, or was someone else involved? Finally, after 6 months, Lee was extradited to South Korea. As many had feared, she immediately proclaimed her innocence through her legal counsel. By that point, it seemed Lee fully understood that no direct evidence existed linking her to the murder, and this she believed would be her strongest advantage in court. However, a critical development emerged when the autopsy results from the National Forensic Service, NFS, were released. The agency concluded that although Lee was a petite woman, she was theoretically capable of committing the crime on her own. According to NFS analysis, on the day of the murder, Lee had been wandering near Mr. Park's house when she noticed the front door was unlocked. With no one paying attention, she quietly entered. At the time, the victim, Ms. A, was fast asleep in the master bedroom. Lee launched a surprise attack, forcefully stomping on A's face. The blow left her disoriented and unable to resist, and her nose was fractured immediately. Taking advantage of the victim's incapacitated state, Lee used an electric cord to strangle her until she lost consciousness. She then continued the assault using a sharp weapon. Though physically smaller, Lee was able to carry out the attack precisely because A was unconscious. Additionally, the victim was the wife of the man Lee had once been romantically involved with, an emotional trigger that may have pushed her into a jealous, vengeful frenzy. To further understand the motive, investigators conducted a thorough background check on Lee. They discovered her real name was Lee Jun-su, born and raised in Busan. During her college years, she had aspired to study abroad in the U.S., a dream she eventually realized. She went on to live in the United States for nearly 20 years, marrying a local man and settling in Denver County, Colorado. Driven by her ambition to rise into the upper class through marriage, Lee quickly encountered harsh realities. She lived in an area known for racial bias, struggled with English, and bore the physical appearance that often made Asian women targets of discrimination. These challenges left her socially isolated, disillusioned, and increasingly detached from the American dream she had once pursued. In this emotional and psychological void, Lee returned to South Korea in hopes of rediscovering a sense of belonging. After 2 decades in the U.S., she relied on her English skills to work as a private tutor, but the low income forced her to take night shifts at karaoke bars. It was in one of these bars that she met Mr. Park, the man who would later lose his wife in a devastating tragedy. From the very first meeting, Lee Jun-su was drawn to Park. He was handsome, successful, and owned a business. The attention he gave her made Lee feel desired, and she quickly developed romantic feelings, pinning her hopes on the idea of starting a new life with him. In her mind, Park represented a chance to escape everything she had failed to achieve in America. But the reality was far from what she imagined. To Park, Lee was nothing more than a casual fling. He had no intention of leaving his loving wife or his adorable young daughter. The feeling of being used and discarded gradually pushed Lee Jun-su into an emotional breakdown. Not long after, Mr. Park's wife, identified as Ms. A, discovered the affair between her husband and Lee. At that point, Lee felt completely cornered and began contemplating a desperate move. In her mind, if A were to disappear, she might take her place as the legal wife. Since Lee's arrest and indictment, the public and legal community have closely followed every twist in the case, especially the question of whether a conviction could be made without direct evidence. In May 2005, the court reached a landmark conclusion. Even in the absence of direct physical proof, if all circumstantial details are logically consistent and point to one possible perpetrator, a guilty verdict can still be rendered. As a result, Lee was sentenced to 15 years in prison, a ruling that was later upheld on appeal. 2 lives, 2 tragedies that seemed unrelated, but both began with unfulfilled desires. One woman killed her boyfriend simply because he deleted her name from his contact list. Another murdered the wife of her lover in the name of love. When obsession crosses the line, it doesn't just take someone else's life, it also burns away the last shred of humanity in the killer. What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss our next deep dive into real-life criminal cases.